So this month marks 100 years of women in law in South Africa. In 1923, the Women Legal Practitioners Act was promulgated. Today, of course, we have many judges and advocates in our legal system. However, there is still some way to go for true equality. I'm joined now by Judge Lebo Modiba. She is the president of the special tribunal that, of course, is mandated to recover public funds stolen through fraud and corruption. Judge, thank you so much for joining us. This centenary, it has to be noted that it was at least, I think, 40 years after this 1923 date when black women were actually allowed to become judges as well. But nevertheless, it is 100 years in total. How important is this to someone like yourself? Judge, can you hear me?
It's actually, yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, all clear.
Yes, Sally, it's 40 years post the act, not when the first black judge was appointed, but when the first black legal practitioner benefited from that act. White women benefited almost immediately, but it took another 40 years for the first black woman to be admitted as an attorney. And then only in 1987 was the first black female admitted to a bar council as an advocate. So these statistics point to the disproportionate position of women in the legal profession. We're certainly not a homogeneous group, and to this day, sadly, that remains. So we're no longer dealing with what Madeline Workey or Sonia Schleschlin dealt with in 1909 and 1912, when women were not allowed at all to be admitted into the legal profession to practice because they were not considered to be persons. So certainly we're not there because that legislation wouldn't pass muster under the current constitution. And that begs the question, why have we still not achieved substantive equality? And it's because we are now operating in a very, very nebulous scenario underpinned by unconscious bias. So really today you'd find anybody who proudly, unlike in the time of Workey and Schleschlin, who would proudly discriminate either on the basis of gender, race, or any other discriminating factor, because our constitution doesn't allow that, right? And there isn't even legislation that legally discriminates on that basis. However, there are practices that remain, and not because so much people intend it, but because they are unconscious of bias in themselves, prejudice that is harbored, either due to upbringing or for many other reasons, that contribute to the disproportionate opportunities being afforded to women and the like,
Yeah. So as a black female judge, do you experience to this day sexism within your line of work? Because I would just imagine that you've got to a position where no one would dare. Am I right?
Yeah, certainly in my own family, I'm first generation legal practitioner, first generation judge. I was born in Alexandra in 1971. I grew up in Alex and Tembisa in the 70s and 80s. It was unthinkable. Even I didn't think that I would reach where I've reached today because of the insurmountable disadvantage that I faced when I was growing up. It was certainly unthinkable, but I mentioned two cases, the one of Workey and Schleschlin. And, when you read those judgments and just trying to make sense of why these two women were excluded from the profession and the opinions of those judges who constituted the bench at that time, clearly misogynistic, right? So my experience is, I mean, I was admitted as an attorney in 1997. I graduated at the turn of apartheid in 1994. My experience certainly has not been like Walkie's experience or Schlesland's experience, you know. I was able to make it into the profession without much of a fuss. But certainly the road has not been an easy one. It was difficult to get articles. I struggled as an attorney to get decent work. Most of the cases I get to preside in as a judge, it's cases I could only dream of being instructed in as a practitioner. So the prejudice, you know, and as we were, we had a ceremonial sitting commemorating the 100 years yesterday. And, you know, I was reflecting on the opinion of those judges. And, you know, even though my experience no way mirrors Walkie's or Schlesland, but the misogynistic opinions of those judges, you know, when juxtaposed against my own experience, which, as I've mentioned, is more driven by unconscious bias than by overt discrimination. I couldn't help but feel that whenever I encounter discrimination, even to this day, my dignity as a woman is eroded.
Yeah, so, you know, the big obvious barriers have been broken, but as you say, those new frontiers now have to be addressed and dealt with openly. I can't let you go without asking you a little bit more about the special tribunal. You were known as the person who sort of really went hard on COVID corruption. But your mandate really is to recover public funds that have been corrupted. And that is so much in our minds, particularly today when we're hearing from Andre de Ruyter about corruption at Eskom. He wouldn't be drawn on the names, of course. But is this something that gives you great satisfaction to see justice when you have success? Or is it actually just a disheartening exercise given the level of corruption in our country?
You know, I wouldn't be drawn into live issues because I could well be called upon to pronounce on the cause of action arising from various issues that are happening at Eskom at this point. So I'm going to answer your question quite broadly.
Yeah.
You know, I carry a very deep sense of constitutional duty to adjudicate upon these cases because corruption is the biggest enemy to constitutional democracy, and the people who are hardest hit are the poorest of the poor in South Africa, who rely heavily on state welfare. So again, there's disproportionality, you know, because people who are better placed financially are able to buy private services that are where the poor depends on government.
Yeah.
So if money intended for the poor is siphoned and it's not used for the correct purpose, for the intended purpose, then the hardest hit are the poor.
Yeah.
You know, I consider myself to be very privileged to have outlived life in one of the poorest townships in the country, Alexandra. So I don't consider myself to be better than, you know, others who were not able to, others whose blood were shed in the streets of Alexandra in the 70s and 90s and 80s during student uprisings. So I consciously, on a daily basis, remember that I actually stand on their shoulders. It's on their blood that I stand, that I today occupy the position that I occupy, and hence this deep sense of duty that I have, which drives me in the work that I do.
Amazing. Judge, one final question. Where do we go from here? Big barriers have been broken down. You've spoken about unconscious bias, but what should everyone involved, particularly in law, and not just women, be aware of in terms of eradicating prejudice, unconscious bias? What are the new frontiers?
Of course, we're anticipating the appointment of the first ever woman Chief Justice. Unfortunately, that's coming almost 30 years after, we became a democratic state. We're looking forward to her wisdom and leadership, and I have no doubt that she will drive not only the judiciary, but also the legal profession towards the substantive equality of women. There's, of course, the role of personal agency, because as I said, unconscious bias is more difficult to address. And this is what I mentioned in the ceremony yesterday, borrowing from a quote from the late Judge Ruth Bader Ginsburg. I don't have it in front of me because I didn't think I'd need to go there. But I always encourage this, and I do that myself, constantly be guarding against prejudice in oneself and be conscious of the role that it plays in the choices that we make, in the decisions that we make, so that whatever choices we make are choices that promote constitutional values and that promote the equality of others.
Yeah, such a wonderful thought, very thought-provoking indeed. Thank you so much for speaking to us this evening. It's been a real pleasure. Judge Lebo Modiba reflecting on 100 years of women in law in South Africa.